You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at NORI, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change.
Hello and welcome to the Reversing Climate Change podcast with NORI. I'm Ross Kenyon. I'm one of the co-founders of NORI, which is a carbon removal marketplace based in Seattle. Today I have with me Jeff Goodell, contributing editor of Rolling Stone, author of The Water Will Come, and his latest, The Heat Will Kill You First, Life and Death on a Scorched Planet. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
Happy to have you. I really liked your previous book, The Water Will Come. And now you're doing fire. So you did one on water, one on fire. Are you going to do a tour of the Greek elements?
Well, this is not exactly fire. This is heat, which is a little bit different than fire.
That's true. They're related, but it's interesting that fire actually doesn't make that much of an appearance in here. Is there much of anything about fire in here?
A little bit about it, yeah. About how more extreme heat dries out landscapes and stresses trees and makes them more prone to these larger, hotter wildfires like we've been seeing, and some of the air pollution consequences of that from the wildfire smoke and things. So I talk about it a little bit, but I don't really go into it a lot.
One thing that caught my attention in your latest is that when I read The Water Will Come, so much of that is about how the U.S. military is preparing for climate change and what they're doing. They're practical people. They want to make sure bases don't flood, that their readiness is up as it can be. But that didn't seem to be as prominent in a story about heat. But given their theaters of operation, you would expect heat to figure into military calculations. But is it not happening, or are you just not tracking that one as closely?
Yeah, it's happening a lot. A lot of the research on heat impacts on human bodies and things comes from military researchers, and the military has done a lot on heat. Several of the scientists, the physiologists that I talked to in the book are former military researchers and physiologists. The whole idea of a what's called a wet bulb standard, which is a more accurate way of measuring temperature, the actual effects on a person, including sunlight, solar radiation, and humidity, and air temperature, and wind speed, and all that kind of stuff. It's a very accurate measurement that is used by heat researchers called wet bulb temperatures. That was developed in the military. But yeah, I don't have as much about it in this book, simply because heat was and is an immense topic, and I just sort of felt like I had done as much as I could, and I could have kept working on this book for another 12 years. So I had to draw some limits.
Yeah, fair enough. There is a lot covered here. There's lots of great reportage too, where it's, heavily vignetted. There's lots of stories of people. It's surprising. I've had heat-related experiences too. One, hiking to the river and back in the Grand Canyon. I went too late in the season one year, and by the time we were like a mile or two out from Indian Wells or Indian Springs or whatever it's called, I was like, I need water right now, or I feel physically endangered. And then last year I played disc golf in Arizona during a shoulder season. It wasn't like I was there in the summer. I think I was there like early fall, and I had to stop. I was getting nauseous about halfway through just because I couldn't continue. And I don't think I realized how imperiled I was with both of those, where you have stories of reasonably physically fit people just dying from heat in cases like that.
Yeah. I, as you know, in the book, tell a story about myself climbing a volcano in Nicaragua on a humid day. This was before I started the book, and I knew nothing about the risk of heat. And, I felt part way up this hike, all of a sudden, my heart started pounding. I started getting really dizzy. I started sweating in an uncontrollable way. It was just like water pouring off me. And I had no idea what was happening to me. I had no idea. And luckily, some of the people who were with me did have some idea. But, like most people, I was terribly undereducated or uneducated about the risks of heat. And, it was a similar walk like that in Phoenix a few years later, when I was thinking about what to do for a next book, when I had to walk just 12 blocks and got dizzy and felt my heart pounding, that I thought, okay, there's people don't understand, including myself, don't understand the risks of extreme heat and what it does to the body. And that's sort of where this book was really born, out of what it did to me and my understanding that I didn't understand what it was doing to me.
Yeah, I think I remember that from that Phoenix walk. Were you like down by the convention centers and the ballpark and stuff in Phoenix? Yeah, it's all concrete and it's just
Yeah.
it's so reflective and it's harsh.
Yeah, it's brutal. And, the air temperature that day was 115 or so, and it was probably 140 degrees there because of the reflective heat. And, this urban heat island effect is a well-known phenomenon in every city. And in Phoenix, especially in that area, it's particularly bad.
The most striking I've ever seen the difference in shade coverage is in Mexico City, where you land at the airport and you're at like a Neza, like on the east side, and there's no trees. It's just concrete baking. And then if you go to Condesa and Roma, like everyone on Instagram is right now, it's nothing but trees, and it's 2-digit degrees cooler everywhere you go. And how does that add up over time and result in different life experiences and how that might affect people's health overall?
Well, I mean, heat doesn't have a cumulative effect on one's body, right? It does have a cumulative effect in the like day-to-day thing, but it doesn't have a cumulative effect sort of year to year. So, I mean, basically what it means is that, people who live in wealthier shaded areas, and shade is very much correlated throughout the world with wealth. I feel it here in Austin, Texas, where I live. I felt it in Mexico City also. I wrote about it in Mexico City. It's just simply a much more hospitable place. And, trees require space and money to maintain and everything. And they, poorer neighborhoods simply don't have them. They have just, in Mexico City or here in Austin, they're concrete sidewalks, lack of trees. Sometimes, there's tree planting campaigns that go on here and in Houston and other in Phoenix where they attempt to put in trees, and they do. But, it's really easy to gather up a bunch of people and get some money to plant some trees, but it's a lot harder to keep them alive, especially in these kinds of hot places, and to keep them watered and everything. And so the long-term life expectancy, I think the life expectancy of street tree in Phoenix is 7 years, which is just nothing. And especially when you think about what you really need are, sort of large canopy trees.
Yeah, when I think of Phoenix too, I think of Palo Verde and things that are, trying to limit water loss, so they don't have large, like deciduous leaves.
Right.
So they're not giving as much shade as you would get from someplace like in Seattle where I am.
Right.
Yeah. But we also have Seattle's cutting down trees right now. There's conflict over the density versus trees and like how much we're actually able to plant right now. And then also there's not that many different varieties of trees that are planted here. So there's also concern about pests. And as the range of these change with heat changes, what should cities be doing right now? I feel like a lot of these problems have a lot of different facets to it, and it's not clear how cities are going to react to this.
Yeah, and every city's different, and the requirements of different cities are different. But to take street trees as an example, I mean, one of the problems is now that because our climate is changing so fast, is that a tree that you plant that works well today is probably going to be that same environment is going to be very different in 20 years, and that tree is not going to do so well in 20 years. So there's a lot of urban arborists and tree planting organizations are thinking about, planting the tree for 20 or 25 years from now, which means a different tree than you would plant if you believed that the climate were going to stay the same, which of course it's not. So, but I mean, tree planting is just one aspect of what cities can be doing and, are beginning to do here in Austin. They're starting an experiment of painting the streets white in some neighborhoods in order to increase reflectivity.
Has that already started? Is that already underway?
Yeah, yeah, it's only maybe a 20 block area right now, but it's happening. LA's been doing it, Vegas has been doing it, Phoenix is doing it. It's helpful on the margins. There's a lot of white roof initiatives around the world, lots of different cities. That's a very easy way to increase reflectivity and lower the sort of urban heat. You know, limiting vehicles from downtown and creating more green spaces, is a big thing. Paris is doing a great job of that, of bringing sort of nature back into cities and turning these parking oases into kind of green oases. That helps a lot. So there are a lot of things that cities can do to help cool off and give people access to cooler places in public spaces, but takes a while, and cities took hundreds of years to build these cities. It's going to take a long time to kind of reimagine them in a way that is suitable for our rapidly changing climate.
How bad do you and the scientists working on this think heat is going to be? I worry about someplace like Phoenix potentially becoming uninhabitable. I have a lot of faith in human adaptation and ingenuity, but stuff you can't fight the wet bulb effect to some degree either. Like how much room is there for us actually to figure this out, or what places will have to be abandoned?
Well, when you ask, will places become uninhabitable, the first response to that is like, uninhabitable for who and at what cost, right? I mean, obviously we can live on Mars if we have enough infrastructure and enough money and, the right kind of rockets and all that kind of thing. I'm just reading a book right now about these submarines that have voyaged down to the deepest parts of the ocean trenches. I mean, we can survive in all kinds of extreme climates. It's just for how long and who and at what cost. So, Phoenix is and has been a boom town because it's a place with cheap real estate, low taxes. Everybody wants to go there and hang out in their shorts and their flip-flops. And, it's sort of, there's something, kind of, everybody likes warm weather. Well, not everybody, but most people prefer warm weather. There's a lot of virtues to it, but those virtues very quickly, get reversed when temperatures get too high. It's one thing to be hanging out in Phoenix in 100-degree weather. It's another thing to be hanging out in Phoenix in 120-degree weather. And it's one thing to be hanging out in Phoenix in 120-degree weather if you have plenty of money and you can afford to air condition your place and you don't care about the electricity costs. It's another thing if you're working as a waitress in a restaurant and you've got 3 kids and you're trying to, feed your family, and then you've got, $600 electric bill because your air conditioner is, ancient and inefficient and you can't afford to run it very often. So, it's a different thing if you're working in a construction crew and you're outside than it is if you're working inside, as a lawyer or something. So these questions of uninhabitability really depend on who you're talking about and at what cost. But, it's very clear that as these temperatures continue to rise, the Phoenix that people know and love, or Vegas or Austin for that matter, that people have known and loved, is going to be very different in the future.
So in a case like Southern Florida, maybe are we going to adapt to that? Are people just going to keep pumping water out, or will they have to leave? Is flooding in that way maybe even more severe because it will require urban abandonment? Or are we just going to double down on all these things and keep innovating and adapting to all of these changing environments?
Well, again, I don't think it's an either or thing. There will be places that will adapt better than others. You can adapt to rising seas. There's things that you can do. Miami, Tampa, all those places, New Orleans, the whole Galveston here in Texas, all of these places, Norfolk on the East Coast, are all hugely at risk with rising seas. And, on one level, rising seas can be dealt with by elevating structures and changing building codes and things like that. But, other parts of it can't, or are much more difficult, like changing where airports are, for example, that are often on low-lying places, changing septic systems that are dependent upon water levels for, sanitation, just even elevating roads and things like that. I mean, at a certain point, the costs of, I mean, could you, engineering wise, could you elevate all of Miami 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet? Yes, you could. You know, it would cost bazillions of dollars, and why would anybody want to do it? But you certainly could. And so there will be places that spend more and more money on adaptation, seawalls, and things like that, and they will become islands of, you know, habitation in these higher sea level zones. And then there will be vast swaths of places that are just deemed not worth putting the money into and abandoned, and it'll have the coastline will look very different than it does now.
Which places do you see changes likely to happen? One potential I saw was labor laws around heat. Is that going to become much more regulated moving forward? You have stories, one in particular out of Oregon, about a nursery worker dying. Is there going to be action on that? Is that something that's likely to change?
Well, you would hope, because it's not expensive way to save lives, right? All you require is, you know, small things like requiring shade and water breaks every, you know, hour for 10 or 15 minutes during when heat levels get high doesn't seem like it would be a difficult thing to do. But, you know, OSHA has been, you know, Department of Labor has been working on federal regulations for heat standards for 7 years now, and they still can't manage to do it because all the corporations complain that it'll hurt their productivity if they have workers, you know, hanging out under a tree for 15 minutes and drinking water. Here in Texas, 2 weeks ago, during the height of the heat dome here, when it was, you know, 112 degrees, 113 degrees here in Austin, the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, signed legislation prohibiting any city or county in Texas from instituting any laws requiring water or shade breaks. And again, in the idea that this was going to hurt productivity and stuff. So, you know, I don't know where this is going to go. You would think, if it were a rational world, that yes, there would be increased heat standards, and, you know, that there would be laws that keep workers from dying while they're on their jobs. But, you know, that may not be the world we live in right now.
It's been remarkable to see how much action has occurred since the Delta lawsuit over falsely representing offsets that they were buying, and like how much movement that has had in the voluntary carbon market space. Wouldn't surprise me if there was a tortious claim from, or even a class action lawsuit against some set of employers for heat-related injury and death that would maybe create the regulation just through the common law, just through the courts. It wouldn't surprise me if that happened. Maybe for you, would that surprise you?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, I think lawsuits are of all sorts on these issues are gaining a lot of power. You know, I'll note that a county in Oregon, the county that Portland is located in, is suing. It has filed a class action lawsuit against big oil companies for the heat wave that killed 1,000 people in the Pacific Northwest in 2021, suing for damages and loss. You know, it's one of a cascading number of these sorts of lawsuits around the world that are basically arguing that the fossil fuel industry has known for a long time what the consequences of the continuing to burn fossil fuels has been, that they've waged a disinformation campaign very effectively about that, and that they are in some way, to be determined by the courts, you know, liable for the losses and damages that are related to this. And, you know, and I've been covering climate change for 20 years, and there's no question that it just in the last 5 years, the momentum on these lawsuits has really accelerated. And, you know, it's been pushed along by these revelations that have come out about ExxonMobil's modeling and how good it was in the 70s on warming related to CO2, and on what's called attribution science, where climate modelers can now say with virtual certainty, as they did with the Pacific Northwest heat wave, that it would not have happened without elevated CO2 in the atmosphere. So not all events can be attributed that clearly. Sometimes, like there was an extreme flooding event in Pakistan last year that they looked at also for attribution, and they basically decided that this may well have happened without the elevated CO2. We can't ascribe it specifically to that. But with heat waves, are particularly are easier to attribute, and not every heat wave can they say this would not have happened without CO2, but a number of them they've been able to, and the Pacific Northwest heat wave was one of them.
That was surprising to me that that level of attribution is even possible or getting better over time, because this is one of the things that I saw people fighting over the broad details of climate science about, oh, well, there's just more monitoring stations. People live more places. So of course there's more damages that accrue over time because people live more places. They're living. So are there really more extreme weather events or bigger ones, or is it just we're better at measuring them now? And this is sort of the anti-climate change is a real threat camp arguing this, but it seems like progress has been made. People can say there is a relationship between this CO2 levels and an extreme climate event or extreme weather event.
Yeah, I mean, and like I said, not every event, and can they? Because what they basically do is they have very sophisticated models that allow them to run a counterfactual. They can run the model, they can program into the model like what happened, and then they can run the same model with lower levels of CO2 and see if they get a similar or same result. And it was very new science 10 years ago, but it's gotten really, really good recently. And I've talked to some lawyers about it, and people who had been skeptical, and they're basically saying, yeah, this is good enough to hold up in court. So the day will come very soon when we can point to a extreme event, not all extreme events, but some extreme events, and say this was caused by elevated CO2 levels, which means basically it was caused by burning fossil fuels.
I mean, that would be a game changer. I remember watching the Trump indictment stuff, and even if there's a mens rea intentionality component to it, where like he would have wanted a coup to happen, the idea that you could say like his ideas, his words led to a one-to-one relationship between what happened after that is super hard to prove. But if you could prove that, that's the whole thing. You have intentionality and you have the action that occurred, but climate change may be at the point of having that.
Yeah, again, not for every event and not in all cases, but in a lot of events. And I would encourage anyone who's interested in this. I have a whole chapter in my book about the whole history of attribution science, and it's a chapter called Anatomy of a Crime Scene. And it focuses on one climate researcher who's particularly well known in this field, named Friederike Otto, who is in the UK. And her work is really phenomenal. And in fact, her recent report about these heat domes in the US that was just released like a week ago was on the front page of the New York Times and most other newspapers around the world. And again, pointed to these heat waves and saying, yes, these were caused by elevated CO2 levels. And so this is not some kind of fringe hocus pocusy, science, some kid modeling stuff in the basement at MIT. This is really serious mainstream stuff that I think going to have dramatic implications on both the legal and the sort of moral status of this relationship between fossil fuel companies and climate damages.
Yeah, that relationship really tightens up pretty quickly if you have all those elements. It certainly caught my ear in listening to this and my eye in reading this. One other thing that caught my attention is the importance of naming heat waves and the fights over that. Can you retell that story here?
Well, I mean, one of the difficult things about heat waves and about understanding heat in general is that there's no visual component to it. So unlike a hurricane where you look out your window and if the wind's blowing 5 miles an hour, it looks very different than when the wind is blowing 70 miles an hour, and you can just tell very quickly what's going on. I'm looking out my window right now here in Austin, and I know that it's 107 degrees, but it doesn't look any different looking out the window than it would if it were 70 degrees. And so visually, we have a very hard time understanding the risks of heat. And so there's a group of meteorologists and a nonprofit group called the Adrian Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, who's really been pushing this idea of naming heat waves similar to the way that we name storms, with the idea that it helps people communicate in shorthand about the risks. And like, if we know, Hurricane Katrina is coming, and then everyone can kind of get that idea. And it becomes a kind of communication shorthand for weathercasters and others to communicate the risks of this. And there's a lot of controversy about it, because unlike hurricanes, for example, which are rated strictly on wind speed, 80 miles an hour. I don't remember the exact category, which category 1, 2, 3, where the wind speed rank is, but they're ranked by wind speed. You can't do the same thing with temperature, because 100 degrees in Phoenix is very different than 100 degrees in Bangor, Maine, and what people are used to, how wet. There's a big difference between dry heat and wet heat. The dangers are different depending on how prepared buildings are, how many people have air conditioning, all that kind of thing. But anyway, it's an attempt to, this idea of naming heat waves is an attempt to help make them visible, and there's all this informal naming going on. They now write literally in the papers yesterday in the Times, there was a story about these environmental groups or climate activist groups in Europe naming these heat waves that are hitting Italy right now after oil companies, and in order to connect them more clearly. And so I think it's kind of inevitable that we will have some kind of formal naming system for heat waves, because we need to do something to do a better job of communicating about them.
I imagine this surprised many people experience your book with too. Is my reaction pretty common, where they're just like, didn't realize this was as big a deal as it is now? And it's do we need to do all this now? Do we need to start naming these heat events? Am I alone in thinking this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a new idea for sure. And whether we need to start naming them now, I don't even know. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who think it's a really good idea. I think that, I think it's a good idea too, but I don't think it's like job one. I think, a more important idea is simply some kind of a ranking system. So if because people get stuck on like, what should we name them? And should we name them after Greek gods? Should we name them after oil companies? Should we do them alphabetical? There's all kinds of politics in naming. And I think that, just getting better at ranking and messaging about them and having weathercasters talk about them is what's kind of really important. And whether that is just a ranking system like red, yellow, orange, something like that, or a numerical system, or naming something that helps people communicate about the kind of risk that is coming with this heat wave, and to prepare for it, right? To check in on people, to make sure that you're, if you have air conditioning, that it's working and all that kind of thing, if you don't, you have access to cooling centers, not to go outside at certain times of the day, all these kinds of simple precautions that people take to stay safe during extreme heat events.
I haven't read one of your earlier books about geoengineering, but you do tell a story about cross-country skiing across Baffin Island with David Keith, which is a great, it wasn't on my bingo card for this podcast about this book. Didn't expect that to happen. But you were covering this beat a long time ago about carbon removal, about geoengineering, when those things were much closer than they are now. I feel like they're very distinct, or at least often people in the carbon removal camp like them to be distinct categories.
Right.
How's this changed since you first wrote that book, which was, I think, 2010? Is that when your geoengineering book came out?
Yeah.
So much has happened since then.
Yeah, so much has happened since then. obviously, the solar geoengineering part, which is the idea of putting particles in the stratosphere to sort of reflect away heat, is still remains a kind of taboo subject. There's nobody doing it. There's
a startup that was doing it that got a bunch of attention. I don't know if you saw that.
But they weren't actually doing it. I mean, they were trying to do little science, little experiments, but I mean, no one's doing it in the sense of flying airplanes around and actually trying to manipulate the Earth's climate. So it's still a kind of, last ditch, nobody wants to talk about, but we may have to do someday kind of idea. And so that's kind of where it was 10 years ago, 13 years ago when I wrote the book. It's advanced a little bit, but it's still on the fringes of science. Carbon removal, as you know, is completely different. Now, I remember visiting David Keith when he was building his sort of little first carbon removal device in an engineering bay at University of Calgary. And it was basically looked like it was made out of silly putty and toilet paper rolls. I mean, it was really a primitive thing. And now, of course, carbon engineering is a big company. You have companies like Occidental Petroleum, saying they're going to be the Tesla of carbon removal. It's getting involved in the offset markets. Airlines are really, I mean, it's taken off in a big way, and so, yes, they really have sort of split in their acceleration into the future. These two different ideas that 15 years ago were lumped under the same idea of geoengineering.
I mean, David Keith is probably the best illustration of that, who is like firmly a godfather of both and so involved there. I see many people, I don't want to out anyone in particular, but many of the carbon removal people that I've spoken to recently, that solar radiation management, at the very least, needs to be well understood. And many of them think it's likely to be necessary even if we don't want it. Do you think that's true? Should we be supportive of more research and maybe even get comfortable with the idea of deploying it?
Well, I certainly don't think we should get comfortable with the idea of deploying it. I think it's, something we don't want to do unless we have to do it. But, I think the idea that it's taboo to talk about, that it's taboo to do any kind of principled research on, I think that we need to know. I still think we need to, and this is very controversial, because a lot of people think that this should just be, like one of those taboo areas of science that nobody should tread into at all, because the potential consequences of fucking it up are so huge. But I do think that we need to know more about the real life consequences of it. And there's David and others have supported the idea of small scale research, where you actually put some particulates in the atmosphere, a very, very small amount that rains out almost immediately, but just to get a real world distribution idea of how they work. And I think more knowledge is good in this context, and I kind of support the idea of a well-structured, well-regulated, well-run scientific research project on this, because there is some sort of tragic inevitability about this, in the sense that I think that it's the way we're going. At some point, somebody's going to try it, and the more we know about it, the better. But I don't know how you exactly structure that program and how you get the rules in place. And it's a very, very, as you know, and probably most listeners know, it's an incredibly divisive and emotional discussion whenever you bring up solar geoengineering.
I was surprised that I heard people recently speaking with such comfort, or it was almost taken for granted that it may just become inevitable at some point, that we will not decarbonize as fast You have multiple sections in your book where you just said we need to stop burning fossil fuels. That's the main thing we have to do. Are we going to do that? And if not, we should prepare ourselves for, much more extreme measures to be taken. But I don't think any of us would choose that freely. Well, probably some people, but it's unlikely that many would.
Yeah, no, you'd have to be insane to say, we should just keep burning fossil fuels and we'll just geoengineer our way out of this. I mean, that's insane. That makes no sense whatsoever. But the fact is we're not doing a very good job of eliminating fossil fuels. And yes, renewable energy is cheaper virtually everywhere in the world for new builds. We're building a lot of it. But the scale and speed that we have to do to really decarbonize our power system is just enormous. And so even though we're building a lot of renewable power around the world, we're still burning a lot of fossil fuels. When you look at the only metric that really matters, which is the CO2 levels in the Mauna Loa graph of CO2 in the atmosphere, the curve is just going up and up and up and up. And so as long as that curve keeps going up, as long as we keep adding CO2 into the atmosphere, it's going to keep getting hotter. And as it keeps getting hotter, we're seeing more and more of these kinds of consequences, that we didn't anticipate. And the risks we see, even with these extreme heat events now, we're seeing how dangerous it is just at this level. And when you think about a kind of doubling of the amount of heat that we've added to the atmosphere over the rest of this century, that's really alarming as to what that would mean for our lives and the lives of every living thing on this planet. So, we got to figure something out. I don't know what the answer will be, but we're doing at once a great job of changing the economic equation on renewable power. 15 years ago, everybody was saying, oh, you got to build coal and gas plants because we need to get cheap power to poor people because, energy is the engine of development, and we need development. And that was sort of always true. And then, now that's flipped, though. If you want to get cheap power to people, the best way to do it is renewable power, solar panels, wind, and things like that. So it's not an economic argument anymore. Now it's we've slipped into this sort of cultural argument stuff where, do you believe what these people are telling you about climate change? Do you believe science? Or do you not? Do you believe these elites are trying to run the world, and George Soros is in this conspiracy with Bill Gates to control our energy systems? And I mean, it's just like it's gotten entrenched in culture wars in a way that it wasn't 10 years ago. And that's a very different political dynamic.
Really strange too, because being dependent upon a couple big oil companies versus having your own homestead generated power, I feel like that back to the land, small scale, conservative, especially if you're like a populist conservative, of not being dependent upon the elites. That's pretty powerful. You even see things like in Texas, where renewables in certain parts of Texas have surprisingly done quite well, and at least the reportages that I've read about it. Apparently that's an economic thing. It doesn't even get to the level of culture. It's just about, is this cheaper and easier and less polluting? It's kind of just a simple equation at that point.
Yeah, well, logic and evidence and simple facts and things are not a big part of the discussion right now. But it's absolutely true. I mean, I'm here in Austin, Texas, and it's the belly of the fossil fuel beast. And nobody talks about it here, or they don't talk about it enough. But Texas is the leader in wind and solar in this country. During these extreme heat waves of the last couple of weeks, we've been getting up to 30% of the power on the grid from renewables, which is amazing. Wow. And not only that, it's cheaper. And not only that, the reason we've been getting so much renewables on the grid is because a lot of the thermal plants have been going down, because these thermal plants have they're much more mechanical, right? A natural gas plant has a lot more moving parts that a solar panel does, and these moving parts and the mechanisms of thermal plants are much more vulnerable to heat, so they are more likely to go offline during these extreme heat events, whereas renewables thrive in this kind of climate. And so Texas is proving the case that not only is a renewable grid cheaper, but it's also more reliable in these kinds of extreme conditions. And for that to be happening in a place like Texas is, I think, a real landmark event. And in a rational world would be a real turning point. But we don't live in a rational world.
Jeff, about 2 years ago, I watched your debate, Can Carbon Removal Bring Us to Net Zero? Do you remember that event?
Yeah.
Why did it go so poorly? It was one of the worst carbon removal discussions I've ever seen. I felt like the terms were not well defined. People like Julio and Elizabeth Jean-Pierre, Julio Friedman was the other discussant. I feel like they were talking past each other. And I think carbon removal people worry that's the future, where carbon removal gets tied up with carbon capture and oil and gas and are not well understood. Environmental justice people are concerned, justifiably so, that carbon removal is going to ignore their interests and create another Cancer Alley kind of situation, like petrochemical or just oil and gas infrastructure generally causes. Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot about that. I know it wasn't your fault. It probably got out of hand, but why was that such an intense carbon removal debate?
Well, I don't really know why it was. I think that Julio and Elizabeth came at this from entirely different perspectives. It was an example of how far, these sort of two polarized parts of the climate movement, energy movement really are, even though they're ostensibly on the same side. They don't understand each other very well. There's a lot of confusion about carbon removal, geoengineering, carbon capture. All of this stuff is very new to a lot of environmentalists and environmental activists. They don't really understand the difference in what they're talking about. And there's been a lot of distrust sowed by the oil and gas industry, who have done a lot of greenwashing obviously over the decades, and to some extent their embrace of this has not helped, even though it has helped in the sense of moving it along financially and engineering wise. And there's a lot of virtues in a big company like Occidental Petroleum or something like that, really staking a claim on this. But there's just this enormous gulf of distrust and disinformation between these sort of various wings of the environmental and climate movement that I think was on display there. And then there was also just personality stuff that some people get along and communicate better than others, and sometimes people are just on different wavelengths entirely.
I imagine at the very least, you're very curious about carbon removal, and you have been for a long time. Do you think that we're doing the right thing, or by focusing our careers on carbon removal, is that a good place to focus right now? Do you think it's a sideshow, some combination? What do you think about carbon removal?
Well, I mean, I think it's obviously a really important technology long term. I think there's no question in my mind that we're going to develop technologies that let us sort of modulate carbon levels. That's a really important idea. And so in that sense, I think it's fabulous, and I think that all of this progress that I've seen in the last decade around it is very encouraging and inspiring. I think the problem is when it gets to be seen as or used as a way just to continue burning fossil fuels, a way to extend the life of oil and gas companies, a way to say, we don't have to worry about climate change because we have these machines that can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And people don't grasp this scope and scale of this project to really take meaningful amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere, how enormous this scaling up has to be. And the simple fact is we are in a climate emergency right now. And technologies that will make a difference in 70 or 80 years at scale, that's great, but we need to do stuff now. And we need to stop burning fossil fuels now. We need to get off of fossil fuels now. We need, we need to do both the short-term, immediate emergency stuff and the long-term, thinking about technology, thinking about stuff like carbon removal and stuff. So I think that sort of time scale gets confused. And I think that a lot of people feel that the amount of money that is being poured into carbon removal is, could be better used in other ways. It's very easy to see how you can make money in carbon removal. It's very hard to see how you can make money in adapting cities to, better weather climate extremes. You're not going to make billions of dollars building better bus stops for people, right? Or
you do a SaaS company that does it, you do pretty well.
Yeah, or planting trees, or building cooling centers, or there's just a lot of things that we need to do in the near term to keep people alive, and to help our world adapt and to move more quickly away from fossil fuels. And I think a lot of people see carbon removal as a kind of brain and money drain away from these more urgent measures.
I've seen a little bit of a sea change in carbon removal recently, where I previously used to hear people say things like, we should work with oil and gas because they have the infrastructure and expertise to run the system in reverse. And I don't hear that as much anymore. I think things like the Oxy CEO's comments that happened recently saying that direct air capture is going to extend fossil fuel infrastructure's lifespan for decades. I think carbon removal companies are increasingly skeptical about becoming a concubine to oil and gas. You're nodding very affirmatively. You think we should stay away?
I think that's a very dangerous place to be, because within the climate movement, and there's just, they are not when I say they, there's obviously all different kinds of actors in this world, just as there are different kinds of people. And by saying they, you're painting with a very broad brush, but they are, have proven themselves very well over the years to be, not good actors, right? That they have pulled political levers, spent billions on disinformation, political manipulation. There's a huge gulf of distrust around, when you look at what I don't even remember the number now. What was it? More than $1 trillion in profits last year. The enormous, profits that they're making during these extreme times. And, there's just a lot of reasons to think that they are not, the best people to buddy up with at a moment like this, both for the larger public good and even for the good of people who are really, engaged in carbon removal, and I'm not dissing carbon removal. I think it's a really important technology. I just think it's a question of, where it fits into the larger movement and where resources are sort of deployed, right?
Just never really wanted an industry as powerful as that to be backed into a corner where their only options are to be stranded or nationalized or something like that. And hopefully having an honorable pivot available to them, maybe seized upon at some point. but I'm increasingly comfortable with the idea that I'm being naive and maybe that is not forthcoming. You don't, you think they would just fight it all the way? But I think you don't want to back them into the corner, do you? Shouldn't they have like a way out?
Well, I mean, no one's talking about shutting them down. There's no like, that's not going to happen. It's just a question of like, for example, stopping new exploration, right? Saying, we're not doing more exploration. We're not giving you more permits to drill in the North Sea. We're not giving you more permits to drill in the petroleum reserve in Alaska. There is a finite end, and we're going to sort of enforce that, right? And from a government point of view, I think that it's pretty obvious that the strategy of oil and gas industry in general, and again, there are good actors and bad actors, and it's not monolithic. There are certainly people who are doing a much better job and are much more progressive and sort of trustworthy than others. But the basic idea, and as you just said, with the comments about carbon removal, is to extend this as long as possible, right? To slow this transition down to renewables and to the elimination of fossil fuels as long as possible for all kinds of obvious balance sheet reasons, stranded assets, all kinds of things. So to the degree that carbon removal has become seen as just a tool to extend that slow transition, that is a very bad place to be politically for this technology, because you're just going to be seen as a tool for these larger interests and not as a solution, but just as a tool. And that is, I think, a bad place to be.
It's very strange to me too, because if oil and gas companies were forced to pay for their emissions to be truly negated with permanent carbon removal, it would very radically change the economics of oil and gas in general. Like the price would go up quite a bit and would hopefully encourage them to decarbonize faster or to switch to being renewable energy companies. I hope. But I also, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I just want to underscore that, there are a lot of people working in the carbon removal space who I have huge respect for. You mentioned Julio Friedman before, a well-known figure in this space. I think he's fantastic. I've known him for years. He's just fantastic. I think David Keith is fantastic. I think David Keith cares more about the planet and the climate and what the right strategy is and how to manage all of this than almost anyone I know. So, I think that there's a lot of really smart, thoughtful people engaged in this, and so I hesitate talking about it in a kind of broad kind of way, but and at a certain point, there's no like, how you control the technology is beyond anyone's kind of reach, right? I mean, for one thing, these oil and gas companies have a lot of money, and a lot of money comes with a lot of power, and they can do with this what they want.
One proposal I've seen is to say that carbon removal can be used for legacy emissions, but shouldn't be used for current emissions. That might address a fair amount of the problem.
Yeah. And, I have to say that, I wrote my book about all this 13 years ago. This book we're talking about now, The Heat Will Kill You First, took up 4 years of my life. The book before that was about sea level rise. And so I do not want to in any way advertise myself as up to date on the latest proposals and sort of dynamics in the carbon removal business, because I am certainly not.
Oh, certainly not. Yeah. That's a lot of beats to cover. There's too many things happening in climate these days to really cover all those beats.
Well, but the interesting things for me, so like we're talking about carbon removal, and as I mentioned a few minutes ago, I remember David Keith's first carbon removal device made of, like I said, of silly putty and toilet paper rolls in the engineering base. So it gives me a really interesting perspective on the movement of these technologies and the movement of the sort of climate and energy world in general. I mean, like I said, the economic change in how we produce energy is so dramatic in the last 15 years, and just this whole conversation shifting away from the economics being reversed is such an enormous deal that I think a lot of people just haven't grasped yet. And here in Texas, I moved here 4 years ago, and you really feel the sort of fossil fuels sort of legacy power, that they have a lot of the institutions here, including the government and state government, but also universities, philanthropic groups and all that, are funded by oil money. And there's a lot of cultural and political inertia behind keeping that alive, even though the economics don't really make sense anymore. And so it's a really interesting kind of dynamic watching that shift, and watching these new clean energy entrepreneurs rising. And then, Elon Musk moving the Tesla Gigafactory here. And, Elon's a whole other, nightmare of paradox and contradictions. But it's just, so there's some advantage in just having been around long enough to watch a lot of these changes play out over the landscape.
Yeah, what a purview you've had. And also listening to and being like, wait, did I hear that right? Is this the same David Keith? I'm like, oh, you're going on a month-long vacation with David Keith. You're as plugged in as anyone to the latest in climate just by that much David Keith FaceTime. You're good, Jeff.
Yeah. In a little tent on ice in the middle of nowhere for 6 weeks. Yeah.
With the shotgun.
I know David very well. And I can only tell you that this trip and all the things we went through and the much hardship and difficulty only increased my respect for him.
Yeah, it's very cool to hear. Well, the book is great. If you're listening, you should definitely pick up a copy of The Heat Will Kill You First. I very much enjoyed it. And also The Water Will Come is great. It's a great book because the work on the military preparedness angle that we started the show with is fascinating. I think people assume that the right-left dynamic is going to play out in the same way, and it doesn't when it comes to sea level rise. It's super interesting reportage. Check out that one too. I need to catch up on your old books. Maybe next time we speak, I'll have all of them under my belt and I'll be fully ready for your next one.
Okay. Sounds good.
Well, thanks for being here, Jeff.
Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.
Thank you so much for listening. If you could please subscribe and give us a great rating and review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify, that'd be much appreciated. It helps us get our content out to more people. You can sign up for our newsletter at nori.com, follow us on social media, and we will catch you next time.